Welcome to ALGINKGO, your virtual campfire talk with fellow eclectics, kindling knowledge synthesis.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Good to see you again. And welcome to all our listeners. Thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Omar Zaid, and I am in Liberty, Kentucky, and we are speaking today with Brother Abdul Karim, who is in Kuala Lumpur. And we have, fortunately, and by God's grace, been able to have an ongoing conversation about Islam, the Muslim situation and condition with respect to past and present, and with a special focus on some valid criticisms that should be addressed by those who take the truth seriously, whether Muslims or not. It doesn't make much difference. We're speaking primarily concerning the revision of our understanding of what we call Al-Islam. And it is our position that much of what has been handed, not all, but much of what has been handed to us as traditionalism has some very serious fundamental flaws in its socio-political platform and theological thinking, if you will, content. So we've discussed some of the errors, and those of you who've been following us are familiar with those. And we've gone through the first 500 years, not in detail, but in some respects, seriously looking at significant errors that have gone undiscussed by most, undiscussed by the majority. And that is what concerns us, myself and Brother Karim and others who are interested in getting Islam and Muslims who are serious about their direction back on course, you see. So we have considered things up to what we might want to call the golden age. And that is what I had suggested we sort of pay attention to as we continue this conversation, dear brother. And when I was there in Kuala Lumpur as an academic fellow, it always impressed me how concerned the academic world was with the golden age, the so-called golden age of Islam. And we're looking there, I suppose, at the medieval period and leading up to the Renaissance and the Ottoman sort of takeover of the Caliphate, which occurred about 500 years ago or so. So there's a period there where Islam seemed to enjoy this golden age, this 500 to 700 year period of just near unmitigated expansion. Stopped by Charles Martel and a few other people in Europe who stood their ground for the Christians. But Islam continued its sort of wing-like expansion east and west along that Mediterranean bases and going east towards and into India during this time. And there was an awful lot of, I can say very, very good occurrences and developments, and we know that Islam played a major role in preserving knowledge from what was the ancient world that had gone into what we call the Dark Ages, and Islam sort of carried that knowledge through, and it was then transmitted to other empires as Islam began to withdraw from its preeminence, you see, as a leader in the world, which happened during the 15th century, if you will, when Columbus made his journey and incursions into the Americas, and Muslims didn't follow. I suppose they didn't think they had to. Europe followed. They gained all that wealth. Whether it was justified or unjustified doesn't make any difference. How they did it, and that was materially responsible for their ascension and the resurrection of their scientific efforts on the back of what Muslims had handed them. So they gained an upper hand, from what I can understand, and as Europe ascended, Islam descended into a period of ignorance and almost degeneration as a prominent civilization, although it certainly had to be dealt with and still has to be dealt with due to sheer numbers and the devotion of Islam's followers on behalf of the Ummah. But this golden period always seemed to be a crutch, if you will, that I saw the academics of the time of our generation leaning on. Instead of confronting errors that we have discussed, instead of addressing injustices in the Sharia, in the support of dictatorships and profound corruption, both in and out of the ulemic circles, if you will. I think I just made up a new adjective. The academics of our age are preoccupied, seem to me to be preoccupied with the Golden Age. And so they wanted to go back and bask in that glory, bask in the emanations that were beyond doubt wonderful and great, you see, and almost miraculous, if you will. So that is okay. And of course, historians and our students need to understand that, and as a fact of life and a fact of history, that yes, Islam did do this. But the way in which it was presented in the conferences, and many of the conferences which I attended, was as if Islam was some sort of monolithic enterprise that just could not be stopped during that age. Now, there's a lot of vigorous activity that takes place just as a result of unity. And it doesn't have to, and unity doesn't always depend on the correct theological or moral position. It could just depend on, it just depends on agreement. So everyone's in agreement that this is the thing we're going to do, this is what we're going to believe, and this is what our tribe professes, and this is how we are, and no, we're just going to go forward with it. And there's a certain lot of esprit de corps. It's not the same spirit of unity that Ibn Khaldun described amongst the people of Medina under the Medina Charter. There's a different period, which we've discussed. But nevertheless, there was this unity that carried Muslims magnificently through this golden age. But the academics that presented this golden age to people like myself and our students always seemed to present it as if it was a monolithic enterprise. And when you think about the religious convictions that are professed in the Shahada, well, okay, that embraces a certain unity, which is sacrosanct, if you will, in throughout most of Islam. And when you realize that people are going to masjid like Catholics do on Sunday every Friday, and they're attending to these things, that provides you with this unity, and leaders can then move forward with that. But as I reviewed the history of that period, I saw an awful lot of division. And, if you look at the Eastern wing with the Mughals in India and throughout that whole region extending to the Levant, from the Levant all the way over to the Indus River and beyond, you see, I called that period an age of keeping up with the Khans, you see, because there was an awful lot of atrocity that took place during those centuries that had nothing to do with what we have discussed as al-Islam per se. It was not sacrosanct in the terms of what Al-Quran presents as the divine order. Muslims, in other words, just took up the same old flag of imperial pursuit that was no different than the period of the Jahiliyyah, except for this unity, you see. And the unity carried them forward. I mean, if you're all under these black flags or whatever these flags are concerned with, the star and the crescent, everybody's in agreement. It's like it's mesmerization, isn't it? Yeah. It's just like the Americans running into Afghanistan or wherever under their stars and stripes. There's no difference, really, psychologically or socio-politically, with the causes of this unity and momentum. Okay, Muslims were a little bit kinder after they killed everybody who didn't agree with them, but you see, um, certainly we know the Jews had it better under Muslim rule than any other rule, and that includes even their own rule in certain dominions, and they don't want to discuss that. But notwithstanding the generosity of Muslims after they gained their dominion by keeping up with the Khans or whatever they were doing, east and west of the Nile, there was no real unity. We have this thing called the caliphate, but whenever you turned away from one sultan to another sultan to another sultan, going westward through the Maghrib and up into Spain, there was nothing but contention and fighting and inner turmoil. And none of that's discussed, you see, when we discuss the Golden Age. What the academics stressed during this time were the wonderful scholars, you see, and the wonderful architects and the wonderful theologians and the wonderful jurists and everything. They seem to shy away from the fact that Sultan so-and-so stabbed Sultan other so-and-so in the back, and the Jews helped them, and all this sort of thing. It just didn't make it into the lectures that I heard, you see, but I read about them, you see, from the various sources that were available to me. So the reason I'm opening this up is because I think you stand in a better position than I do as someone who's studied the history, and especially from a socio-political perspective, joined to the theological perspective that you are trying to correct now with your own publications. So my question to you is, am I correct? Was this some sort of false monolith that is presented as the Golden Age? And if so, how do you view it as a convert and as an academician who is sort of how shall I say swimming against the stream? You see? What are your views, dear brother, on the golden age, the so-called golden age of Islam, and how do you see it with respect now to the what you found underneath the stones that you overturned?
Yeah, thank you, Brother Omar, for that. That's a big question, but hopefully I'll be able to, step up to the challenge. Before I begin, may I just...
Of course. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Yeah, so thank you once again for having this discussion. I find these discussions very interesting, and I always look forward to the next one, even if I have to wait an extra week for it. Just kidding. There's a saying, good things are worth waiting for. So, yeah.
Yes, I think there's some advantage to it, because if we have maybe longer intervals, it gives some of our listeners more time to catch up with us. That's fine.
Yeah, and moreover, the fact that you are speaking from Liberty, Kentucky, I take that to mean that am I at liberty to speak what's on my mind, so to speak?
Of course. Please do.
So we have freedom of expression. Very good.
Yes.
That's a very interesting name. But of course, America, after all, presents itself as the land of the free and what have you. And many European immigrants, and even my own family, even though we didn't make it quite to America, we made it to your neighbor, Canada. And so we set down some roots there. But to come back to your question, this golden age, yes. As someone who has actually studied the Western civilization as well, whenever I'm looking at the intellectual and political history of the Islamic civilization, of course, I see both parallels and differences. And these parallels and differences I kind of summed up in one of my books. This was a book that I was going to write at Harvard University when I applied to for one of their scholarships. I didn't get the scholarship, unfortunately, but fortunately, on the bright side, I managed to finish the book before I got into the program. So there was one good thing that came out of it. And I even said this to the lady who informed me that, so sorry, but you didn't make it. And I basically replied to her, thank you very much. But actually, I realized now that I finished my book, I don't need to go and take up a scholarship.
Is that so? No, that's very interesting.
Yeah, because I, for some reason, I expected that I was definitely going to get in. So, but I wanted to show up there with a product or a draft that was as good as I could manage, and so I really worked very, very hard until the last day to make it as good as possible. So, anyway, it's published. I have it on Amazon. It's under the title "Islam and the West." And basically, what I have outlined there is that I took a conceptual approach. My sort of philosophical paradigm is linked to the way that we used to study Western political philosophy. I certainly admit that this was the background with which I'm approaching, the Islamic studies. And among, as I mentioned, the friends of Leo Strauss, at least at the University of Toronto.
Yes.
The basic dichotomy, philosophical theological dichotomy, was between what people used to call Athens and Jerusalem dichotomy. Now we Muslims can substitute, how do I put this, Mecca or an Islamic city for Jerusalem. But basically, this division actually reflects what we think of as the so-called tension between reason on the one hand and revelation on the other. In other words, the tension between human rationality and divine speech on the other. So how exactly do we reconcile this tension? And is it a tension in the first place? Because there's a view which was expressed, for example, at least in a Western philosophical tradition by John Locke, in his first treatise of government. I've written a paper on some topic there. And he makes a very interesting statement there when he says that, I quote, this is pretty much verbatim. He says, I quote, the law of reason is the same as the law of God, end of quote, meaning that there is no tension at all between reason and revelation. If it is rational, then it is definitely in agreement with God's word, and if it is God's word, it is definitely, rational. Now, this does not mean that somehow reason is becomes an equal of revelation. Of course not. Any more than a human being can become an equal of God. There is no such thing. But the rational faculty or reason enables us to understand the revelation. So that is how we should be going about it. But what I found in my research is that in the Western philosophical tradition and political tradition, the struggle between reason and revelation culminated with the so-called age of enlightenment, or the age of reason, as it is also called. Yes. And in this encounter between reason and revelation, exemplified at the practical level by the conflict between the church and the philosophers or the rationalists, we know that the long-term results was a decisive victory of rationality over organized religions, specifically the church. So the church was basically sidelined and privatized, if you like, and new constitutions were developed on the basis of reason, mainly, like, for instance, the Constitution of the United States or the Declaration of, Independence. So this new way of thinking, notice that, by the way, enlightenment here meant for the people of the Enlightenment as the light of reason. You see, they didn't talk about the light of revelation, although, to be sure, I should point out also that Maximilien Robespierre, who was the leader of the extremist Jacobin faction during the French Revolution, he at one time organized what he called a festival in honor of the Supreme Being, end of quote, Supreme Being. So that was clearly a reference to God. So I think we can conclude from that, even though they committed many atrocities, like the Reign of Terror in 1792, I believe, yes, where they slaughtered 16,000 supporters of tradition of the monarchy. You see, so basically, the rational paradigm, or the age of reason, or the orthodoxy of rationalism in Europe was established through not just pure argumentation, although there were efforts in that direction, and John Locke was one of the people who contributed in that area, but they were, I don't know if I should use the right word, cemented through brutal political repression, as happened during the French Revolution.
Yes, yes.
Now, when we look at the Muslim tradition, something very similar transpired in the world of Islam, but 1,000 years earlier. 1,006 years earlier, to be precise, because it was at the time of Musa al-Hadi, the older brother of Harun al-Rashid, who actually initiated the Golden Age. Harun al-Rashid, we can say the Golden Age started with him, but his older brother organized something similar to the Reign of Terror, I would suggest, in the Muslim world, when he spearheaded the slaughter of 5,000 rationalists or philosophers. In a massacre that was reported to us by Suyuti, and then also after Suyuti by Jamaluddin al-Afghani. And for the viewers who have doubts about this claim, they can check it online. It is mentioned in a book called Modernist Islam, published by Oxford University Press, edited by Charles Kurzman, and the reference is found in the article on Jamaluddin al-Afghani. So in other words, the Muslim world has its own Inquisition, and it actually started earlier than what we are told by traditional scholars. Because the traditional scholars are trying to tell us that the real Inquisition, the so-called Mihna, started under one of the rationalists, Al-Ma'mun, in 809, and it went on, I think, for 18 years. It was finally ended by Al-Mutawakkil in 851. But the tradition is very rarely, if ever, tell us that actually the Mihna, the Islamic, the Inquisition in the world of Islam actually was started earlier in 780. And 786 was when the major massacre happened. I think the person who was the person? I think it was the third Abbasid Caliph who started the Mihna in 780. So what I'm trying to say is that in the world of Islam, tradition decisively defeated reason, while in the Western world, 1,000 years later, reason decisively defeated tradition. So my conclusion from this comparison is that neither Islam nor the West have succeeded in striking the proper balance between the reason and revelation. Each civilization went too far to one side. The
Yes.
Western world went too far in the direction of reason, but the Muslim side went too far in the direction of tradition understood as revelation, you see. And
Yes.
we are the heirs of this victory of traditionalism over rationalism. And now, where does the golden age come in
Yes, please.
this discussion, you see? Well, when you look at the Islamic history, as I was suggesting earlier, the Western history seems to be like a moving between two, like a pendulum is moving from one end to the other, from reason to revelation and back again, what have you. But something similar has transpired also in Islamic intellectual and political history, because we start, of course, with the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet. And that, you could say, was something like a golden age right there, you see. And you could argue, as some have argued, that this golden age lasted until the assassination of Omar, when the first fitna broke out. I don't think anybody would call the fighting between Muslims, the Battle of Camel and the Battle of Siffin, as a golden age. Definitely not. So if you want to look at that period, the very early period of Islamic history until the assassination of Omar, that could be perceived as a golden age of sorts. But then we have these fitnas, and then what comes later on is that a tradition begins to assert itself quite powerfully. And then we have a very dramatic swing towards traditionalism, and the peak of this swing, the extreme end of this swing, is reached when the massacre of the philosophers takes place. Now, that's where the pendulum reaches its, farthest point from the center, and then comes Harun al-Rashid, and he begins a reversal of this traditionalism, and he opens up the community to reason and rationalism once again. He expands or enhances the Baitul Hikmah, in Baghdad. He invites all these foreign scientists. He commissions the translations of works. Actually, that was Al-Ma'mun mostly who did that, but Harun al-Rashid kind of got the ball rolling, I think. And even we have the 1001 Nights stories coming to us from the time of Harun al-Rashid. So what makes this particular period golden? I think it is the energy, the vivacity, the vitality, and the flowering of the arts and sciences, and the openness and inclusivity of the way the people at that time understood the deen. Although, of course, there were some anomalies. I'm sure that there was something like a mihna also, and I don't deny that it didn't take place. What I'm suggesting is that the mihna under the Mu'tazilites or the rationalists was far less, dangerous and harmful than the mihna that took place under Musa al-Hadi. There's no comparison, if you ask me. So why are the traditional ulama not telling us more information about this? Why is this being, as it were, covered up? Isn't covering up the truth, in fact, a form of kufr? Sorry, I don't mean to be harsh. But we as scientists or people, academic people who are interested in the truth, we want to know what happened or what really happened. In fact, there's a very interesting website in the US called What Really Happened. I highly recommend it. They have an interesting take on many things. So, yeah, we want to know what really happened. Let's think of ourselves as detectives. Here we have Sherlock Holmes and John Watson trying to find out who done it, who is the culprit, what contributed to the decline of the Islamic civilization. Well, to answer the question is not rocket science. All we need to do is ask ourselves, well, what led to the rise of the Islamic civilization? And once we find out what led to the rise of the Islamic civilization, what led to the golden age, then we can let's then agree that if this is what led to the rise of the civilization, its opposite must have led to its decline. So now, what was it that led to the rise of the Islamic civilization? Clearly, it was the Quran. This book, unique, provided guidance and uplift to the Arabs of the time, of course, who accepted it, and later to the broader community of humanity, at least those people who accepted it. So now the fall, once again, of the Muslim civilization, I think, can be traced to basically as I argue in some of my work, to a turning away from the Book of Allah and turning to some other books, the books of man-made tradition that we call the Hadith. That was the downfall of the Muslim Ummah. And I think this, I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we should throw out all the Hadith. Definitely not. After all, the Quran presents itself as the best hadith, ahsanul hadith, and the Quran, Allah tells us in the Quran that He gives the best tafsir, ahsanul tafsir. So we can find the best hadith in the Quran and the best tafsir in the Quran. So, but still, I'm not saying that we should throw out all the hadith, Bukhari, and all the others. No, I say let's keep them, but with some conditions attached to it. Yes, we can keep Bukhari and the others as references if we want to find out what may have happened in the past. But we have to read all this with a critical eye. We cannot simply accept at face value and become blind followers. Number two, yes, we can, follow even some of the hadiths as sunnah, you see, because there's a group of scholars who use the word sunnah to mean as something that is merely recommended, but not something that is required. You see, there's a huge difference between making something required and simply saying this is recommended. Like people say, well, I did 2 sunnah rakat after my fajr or whatever. Fine. You didn't have to do it, but you can do it. Similarly, I would say that the hadith can be accepted as something like sunnah in that sense, something that is recommended, at least that part which agrees with the Quran, but not something that is binding. Now, once again, there is a huge difference. Number three, I would say, yes, we can still incorporate hadith as part of the Islamic heritage. After all, it is a part of Islamic heritage, even if it may contain some good, some bad, and even a little bit of the ugly. We know that. So, but we cannot treat the hadith in any sense whatsoever as any kind of equal to the words of Allah. That is completely impossible. If we do that, we will fall into, did we call it paraphrastic shirk last time? I have another
paraphrastic shirk. Yes.
I have another expression for it. I call, I call it, scriptural polytheism or scriptural shirk. The moment you say that Bukhari is equal to the Book of Allah, you have committed what I would call scriptural shirk. You have given a partner to the Book of Allah. Bukhari is not a partner to the Book of Allah. Allah does not have partners, so how can His book have any partners? And can you give a partner to the Book of Allah without suggesting that Allah also may have a partner? I don't think so, bro. That is a no-go. That is a no-brainer. So we're not going anywhere with that. And number four, I believe we need to affirm that the hadith, as I said, we can use it for these purposes I mentioned. You want to get some hikmah out of it. For example, that you should leave a place in as good a place as you find it. That is I believe it's a true hadith, and I believe the Prophet may very well have said something like that. Or when the Prophet said, for example, don't write any hadith from me. I think that is a true hadith. But I don't say that it is Islamic law or that it is revelation, right? So yes, there are hadiths that may contain truth and that may contain some hikmah. Let's keep that. But we always need to match up the hadith against the Quran, and any hadith that contradicts the Quran, as Taha Jabir Alwani pointed out in his book, published in 2017 by IIIT, called Reviving the Balance. He says, I quote, any hadith that contradicts the Quran must be considered fabricated, end of quote. So we cannot, in other words, so my last point is that, yes, we can use the hadith for some purposes, but not for any of the purposes I mentioned earlier, and definitely not as a source or basis for Islamic law. Because as we have seen in practice, some of the hadiths, and not only have the hadiths been raised to a level of revelation and equality with the Quran, and the traditions even have a hadith to back that up. They say the Prophet allegedly said, I was given 2 things, the Quran and something equal to it, the hadith. The word equal is used on Ibn Baz website, although the Arabic term is mithlihi, which means something similar. But even then, hadith is not even something similar. Allah challenges us in the Quran to produce something similar. If we don't believe the Quran is from Allah, produce 10 surahs like this Quran, or in this Quran, or at least 1 surah. No one has managed to do it. That doesn't mean that they didn't claim that they did it, because the people who compiled the hadith books actually did take up the challenge And they produced not one surah or 10 surahs, they produced 100 books of hadith that they claim are equal, that they claim are revelation, you see. And I say 100 because in the Shia, Sunni tradition, you have 60 books of hadith, not just the main 6 books, but there are 50 plus others. And the Shias have another 40 or so hadith books. So are we expected to believe that Allah Ta'ala sent us 100 additional books of hadith to help to explain what he meant the first time in the Quran? I mean, these are really some preposterous suggestions. So that is why I say that we can accept the hadith for some purposes, but not for the purpose, not as a basis of Islamic law, not as binding, but merely basically as, you know, something that may contain some hikmah, some wisdom, and that may maybe follow, that is optional but not binding. So so what I'm suggesting is that the ulama, the error was not including the hadith corpus as part of the Islamic learning and tradition. No, that was not the mistake. The mistake was in incorporating the hadith into the body of Islamic knowledge as an equal partner of the Quran. That was the mistake.
Yes. And so you say that you're suggesting that this led to Islam's downfall.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Inna Allah la yahdikum.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just quoting from the Quran. Inna Allah la yahdikum zalimin. That means Allah does not guide wrongdoers, you see. And even Tahajabir al-Wani says in his book that the Muslim, and he's a traditional, neo-traditional Sunni scholar. He's not a Quran-centric scholar. He's a Sunni scholar. He says the Muslim abandon the Quran almost entirely, you see. First, they turn to the traditions, the hadith, and then they even threw the hadith under the bus, so to speak, and turned to the work of the ulama and followed them, you see. And this is confirmed in a paper by Sultan Butti Sultan Ali al-Muhairi from the United Arab Emirates. The paper is called Sharia in the United Arab Emirates, the modern period and the pre-modern period. There are 2 papers, you can find them online. And he says that basically with the closure of the gates to ijtihad, which was part of this process of degeneration, and the rise of taqlid, or blind following or imitation, the so-called primary sources of Islam, Quran and Sunnah, actually became remote. He uses the word remote, distant. And the works of the ulama, in fact, became the primary sources, you see. And this perspective was reinforced also by John Esposito when he wrote in one of his papers that basically what happened is that the ulama claim that they interpret the hadith, and the hadith interprets the Quran, and therefore the ulama, basically the way he puts it, the ijma, or the agreement of the ulama, overrules everything. So now ijma, or the consensus of the scholars, now becomes the top authority. Excuse me, did I hear that correctly? There's an excellent article, I mean a video on YouTube by Dr. Omar Ramahi about whether ijma is a form of shirk. There are some scholars, for example, Ibn Hazm, who rejected ijma as a source of Islamic law. And this could be, we could raise this question with respect to other alleged sources of Islamic law, like, for instance, the hadith, you see, as I am questioning. And I'm not alone, because Taha Jabir al-Wani also and Muhammad Shahrur say pretty much similar, make similar arguments in their books, you see. So this was the huge error, I think, in the Muslim intellectual tradition, is to mix the words of Allah with the words of human beings. Ibn Baz has even the audacity to say that, I quote, this is verbatim, the Sunnah is a part of the Quran, end of quote. Part of the Quran. So the words of human beings now become part of the words of God. Has he lost his mind? I'm really amazed. And then he says it is not separable from the Sunnah, is not separable from the Quran. So here we have a blending, you see, of the Sunnah with the Quran. And in some people's minds, I fear, even the Prophet has been blended with Allah. Some people seem to have difficulty differentiating between the two. I was recently watching a debate between Jawad Hashmi and Dr. Al-Masri, you know, in about, you know, whether Islam is exclusivist or inclusivist. And I was amazed that Dr. Al-Masri made a claim several times that we Muslims have to submit to, guess who? Did he say Allah? No. So then if not to Allah, then who? He said the prophets. We have to submit to the prophets. I was shocked. So If we so it does the Quran call us to submit to the prophets? And then he identifies the root of Islam as with the prophet. Well, I'm sorry, Islam didn't come to us. Islam was sent to us by Allah. The prophet communicated it to us, you see. So there's a huge confusion. And let me give one more example. The great so-called Imam al-Ghazali himself says on page 9, Roman numerals, in his book of knowledge, the New Delhi edition, he refers to Muhammad on that page as, I quote, are you ready for this? The Lord of mankind, end of quote. What? Did I hear that correctly? Muhammad is the Lord of mankind? Has he lost his mind? If the Muhammad is the Lord of mankind, then pray tell, who is Allah? You see how deep this confusion goes.
Yes.
So anyway, maybe I should land my point there. But so what I'm saying is that after the slaughter of the philosophers by 786, I would place the beginning of the Golden Age there. Why? Because people were allowed to think again, you see. And we had this flowering of the arts and sciences. And this went on until 851, when Al-Mutawakkil reversed the policy of rationalists, the Mu'tazilites. Basically, what I'm suggesting is that the Golden Age took place when the Mu'tazilites were in power, despite the fact that they committed some excesses. I don't deny those. So it ended, in 851. So now Harun al-Rashid started ruling in 786. That's 14 years plus 51. That's 65 years. That's how long the Golden Age lasted, if you ask me. Now, some people put the Golden Age, make it longer than that, and they say that it lasted until the sacking of Baghdad in 1258. I would not count that period as part of the Golden Age, because the persecution of the rationalists resumed under Al-Mutawakkil. So to me, that could not be part of any Golden Age. I think that was already a decline taking place. So I don't know whether that helps or not, but please correct me if I missed anything.
Well, it seemed to me that when discussing the Golden Age, when I was amongst the ulama as a research fellow, they extended this period to Toledo,
I'm aware of that.
The Spanish experience. And what you're saying is no, it doesn't extend there. That's just sort of a rainbow effect, or some sort of a mirror that continued, but it wasn't really part of the Golden Age, because the Golden Age belongs to that period where the Mu'tazilites were in power and reason was reasserting itself in parallel with Al-Quran, and tradition was taking a bit of a back seat, although it was still there. So what I hear you saying, I'll try to summarize it just from my perspective as a listener here, is that the Quran itself was unstoppable as a force that would lead anyone who received it into this golden period. The gold being pure, receiving pure guidance, if you will. So, and the only way we can receive pure guidance is if we use our reason. But then with this closing of the reason, the closing of Ijtihad, the tradition that first resurrected before this Mu'tazilite period then reasserted itself, and then it sort of petrified the metaphysical growth of Islam, even though the physical growth continued by virtue of pure material wealth and power and dominion, if you will, over that Mediterranean sphere, extending even eastward into the Indus Valley and so forth. So there were two forces here. One is the force of inspiration, this power, this guidance that comes with it, that allows us to permit, we're giving permission, you see, for Allah to sit on the throne, as Instructor Bilal puts it, the throne of our thought processing, you see, the throne of our mentation. And this is then replaced, sealing heaven, with tradition, so that it becomes a bit of an iron dome. And then, well, my God, what happened? We've discussed this before. The if we take this whole thing leading up to the Enlightenment, this period that followed the initial Reformation of the Church, and then led to the Enlightenment, because the Reformation was obviously incomplete. So the same sort of thing happened to Islam, but for slightly different reasons. But the archetype is the same. When we seal the dome with tradition, you see, and we no longer allow for inspiration, this gift of the prophethood that Muhammad specifically said he left behind, we're submitting not to Allah as Lord, we're submitting to this priesthood, which is what the Catholics and the Christians have done. And that was the same sort of problem that they had with the reformists in the Christian tradition. They tried to reform the church, and they replaced it with another form of priesthood. And they couldn't break through this iron dome of tradition because of the biases which are there through false interpretations or erroneous interpretations of what the scripture actually represents. Now, I had a discussion recently with instructor Bilal, and we talked about this, and in a different way. We talked about the hadith that represents that is references Aisha when she was asked about the prophet and asked about the Quran, and someone asked her something specific about the Quran. I don't remember the exact words, but her response was, "Have you not seen the prophet?" You see, if you've seen the prophet, then you've read the Quran, because he embodies the Quran. Now, this does not make him Lord, because the Quran is a revelation, you see. So, but this makes him an example of the reformed man, you see. What others in the esoteric Christian tradition called the risen Christ within, or the celestial man, the man who's trying to regain the relationship that Adam once had with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, okay? And it's possible, apparently, you see. So, but you don't have to enter into all these sort of ritualistic, legalistic practices to try and become so super pious. You see, you can walk with God. No, it is Allah who chooses whom he walks with, not us who chooses to walk with him. See, and that's the way I sort of see it from my perspective here in this seat in my own little study here. In any case, the Muslims made the same short-sighted mistake that the Christians did with their Reformation and then their Enlightenment, because many of the people who were involved in the Enlightenment, despite their professed atheism, such as you just mentioned with Robespierre, you see, that murdering SOB. Anyway, you see, they made the same mistake because their bias went with them into this new socio-political process, and it still cut them off from divine guidance. So this appears to be the same sort of phenomena that has happened to Muslims, and they're yet to admit it. You see, they're yet to admit that, yeah, their own tradition has cut them off from divine guidance. And instead of submitting to the Lord of divine guidance, they're submitting to the lords of this tradition, you see, which is no different than a priesthood under people who consider their own interpretations to be infallible, you see. And once you box people in like that, you've got a sort of systemic indoctrination, which controls the entire process of mentation, so that they're no longer practicing rationalism. They can't do it. And even if they do practice rationalism, it's only within this box. They cannot expand it. And from what I understand now, as the Quran becomes more meaningful to me individually and to those of my students and friends and colleagues who are taking another look at it, the Quran is a living, breathing organism, if you will. It is something that cannot be boxed in. It is something that cannot dwell in a boxed in interpretation, especially when that interpretation, as you've demonstrated and others have demonstrated, is full of errors, just as the Judeo-Christian translations are filled with errors, some of them manifestly serious in nature, serious in their theological misinterpretations and vain imaginations. You see, so this whole transformation of Islam into a revised struggle. The Christians sort of use this word revival all the time. We want to revive, but they're reviving the same old thing, you see. Revision doesn't mean you're going to revise the same old thing. Revision means you're going to correct your errors, you see. And when I'm writing a novel and I go back through it and I see grammatical errors, I see errors in interpretation of certain myths that I'm trying to incorporate into the novel, I see historical errors and I have to correct them. You see, because when you're writing as an author, when you're writing your first drafts, you're always sort of in a hurry, and you rush to the end of the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, and you miss certain things along the way, and then you go back to revise, and you say, "Oh my God, how could I have let that? How could I have not seen that error? It's so blatant." Revisionism means to correct. You see, and that's why I'm earnestly seeking this conversation with you. Not that you and I are going to revise, that's probably beyond us. Okay, but the next generation is going to listen to people like yourself and myself and others whom you and I refer to along the way, because many of these other people we're referring to, they don't have the time or the convenience to access the internet and make presentations like this. So these people are going to have to look at it and say, well, Dr. Omar said that, and Brother Karim said this, and I think Instructor Bilal said this, and I'm just wondering, and Hamid Chan said that, and I think we better take another look at this thing. Because, that is an error. That is a mistake. That is a false teaching. That is not the truth. So you cannot revise something. It's like, let's just take a corpse, if you will. Okay, rise from the dead and keep the disease that killed you. Okay, no, I don't think so. I think if we accept the doctrine of resurrection, we're not going to be raised in the same bodies that we had damaged with our sinful neglect while we were alive in this flesh. We're hopefully going to be raised in a new body, a new earth, a new environment, and given a clean slate, for God's sake, because that's what we need. So if we're going to revise Islam, we need a uncorrupt perspective. And that means we have to remove the bias, or we have to at least identify that it's there and it's incorrect, you see. And that's what we're doing here. So what I hear you say is that during this so-called period of the Golden Age, these traditions, with these fixed biases, were then set into concrete, written into stone, if you will, and discussed as if, hey, that's the be-all and the end-all of this revelatory process. We're not taking it any further. That's all you need to know. And so bow down 5 times a day, make sure you pay your zakat, and you're going to live for the hereafter from now on. I mean, that seems to be the reactionary message after Ghazali made his mistakes, you see, if I'm reading the history correct. And so on they went into this golden age. And what was the result of that? How did they become so rich? They became rich through, shall I dare say the word, imperial pursuit? They, you know, when I look at the Arabs, look, there ain't much there in the desert now, is there?
Yeah, there's oil now.
Yeah, well, they got the black gold. Okay, but you just ignore that black gold. Okay, let's go back, 1,000 years ago. There weren't any oil. You got coconut, you got sand, you got camels, you got goats, and you got a lot of overgrazing and more desertification taking place. If you listen to Abdul Karim at Oxford, he wrote this history of the Arabs. I read that. I was very impressed by that very frank and straightforward history, which nobody in academia I knew referred to, you see, whenever they're talking about the Golden Age. So what happened was the desert Arabs, these Bedouins, these people who took up the flag after the righteous caliphs were all wiped out. They didn't have enough gold. They had to go and they didn't have enough substance. They had to go and take it from other people who had it, and those other people's their lands, their dominions were based on foreign theological concepts. So they just justified their murder and the theft in the name of Allah. And then they became enriched. They enriched themselves. They shared their taxes, their booty, if you will, with their nepotism, this enclosed circle of trust. And then they appointed their cousins and their daughters and their sons and their nieces and their closest friends to certain thrones throughout this so-called monolithic thing called Islam. And they acted as if they had made it, when in fact they had stolen it. So for the most part, even Salahuddin, as great a man as he was, he referred him. He immediately established another dynasty against the Sunnah of the beloved Prophet, you see, who established the Medina Charter and spoke against dynasty. This is not the divine guidance. So this then was doomed to failure. This golden age was doomed to failure for this reason alone. Because if you're basing your success on graft and murder and thievery of people who don't agree with you, you see, and then charging taxes for this, that, and the next thing, of passage of all this wonderful wealth that you did not create, you see, this is not being the caliph. This is not managing. This is not managing creation. This is a gang. They're just gangsters dressed up like sultans and wonderful magical leaders on their carpets for 1,001 nights. I can't accept this as divinely ordered. I can see it as divinely permitted because Allah permits us to commit sin. Allah permits us to enter into delusion. Allah permits us to stay in that blindness. Matter of fact, if we stay in it long enough, He permanently blinds us. The Quran makes that very clear, if I understand it correctly. So, having all said that, brother, I'm just trying to summarize the implications of what you have said from a different perspective. And it appalls me, frankly. So now I understand a little bit clearer why it is that I sat in all these conferences and during all these people saying these wonderful things about this golden age, and I was metaphysically squirming, the whole time. I said, well, there's something wrong about this. It sounds too Catholic to me, because the Catholics did the same thing. You see, the priesthood, they did the same thing. And so what you're saying is that, okay, I've got one more point to make here before I hand the floor back to you, brother, is that the Enlightenment did the reversal, okay, of what you said the Muslims did 1,000 years before.
Yeah.
But the rationalists of 1,000 years earlier in Islam, they were trying to follow the Quran,
yes,
using reason.
yes,
You see,
exactly.
so that they would then see that the Quran is not separate from our life here on earth. It is this guide, it is this shining light, and we don't need anyone between us and the Quran to be able to see what it says so clearly. We don't need this tradition, we don't need this legalism. And the sultans who were performing the theft I've just related, and said, okay, well, I need a group of priests who are going to justify my thievery. They're going to justify my imperialism. So let's just, kill them. Let's kill these rationalists and get on with the imperial pursuit. And this is what the Romans did. The Roman emperors did this. They would send to the Sibyls up on the mountain and purchase a new prophecy that justified their murderous reign. You see? There's no difference, brother. This is appalling. And what amazes me is that most of our brothers and sisters have no idea that this is what actually happened. Correct me if I'm wrong, please.
No, you're not wrong. I think you hit the nail on the head, and that was an excellent summary, by the way. Congratulations. Yeah. A good account of this can be found in Muhammad Shahrur's book called Quran, Morality and Critical Reason. In chapter 6, he pretty much explains this same thing, but in substantial detail. So yeah, it's unfortunate. So if the Ummah wants to go back to have another golden age, they need to go back to that which gave rise to the first golden age, and that was our Quran. And secondly, I think the best way to do that is to re-engage the services of reason, to rehabilitate reason and reasoning, because it is reason that that enables us to understand and to follow the revelation of the Quran. Without using our mind, we are not going to be able to understand and follow the Quran. So we need to do both. Return to the Quran by re-engaging our rational faculty to understand and follow the Quran. Yeah.
Well then, thank you, dear brother. May it please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to guide us and to help us to revise this thing that we hold so dear in our hearts, called Al-Islam, and return to Al-Quran as he intended us to read it. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until next week, brother.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.